Coming out on a winter's night, and thank you to all of those online. Significant number, I understand. It's good to see everyone for this very joyful annual occasion. My name is Graham Shipley, for those who may not know me. I've got a couple of pages to read, maybe 6 or 7 minutes worth. There's quite a lot to say, so I wouldn't normally introduce a lecture at that length. And I will eventually introduce the speaker, of course. Welcome to the 23rd Buchan Memorial Lecture in Ancient History. The lecture was previously named after Dorothy Buchan and now also commemorates her husband, Alan Buchan. It's great to be hosting an event that's approaching its quarter century, thanks to generous benefactions from the Buchan family, some of whom are joining us online, their friends, many people in the university, in Leicestershire and Rutland, and further afield. As always, we're pleased that Alistair Buchan in particular is with us online, who has done so much to promote the series. We also thank the Society for the Promotion of Hellenic Studies, or Hellenic Society for short, for their contribution to the costs of the event. And we encourage anyone, especially students, to join what I believe is Britain's leading organisation for the study of Greece specifically. The Society publishes the world-leading Journal of Hellenic Studies, the invaluable archaeological reports on discoveries across the Greek world, and the relatively new, exciting magazine Argo, with accessible and entertaining articles about the ancient world. And indeed, the current issue of Argo, with perfect timing in this 60th anniversary month, includes an article on Doctor Who's encounter with the Trojan War in 1965. Which I include especially for Alistair and any other medics who may be online or present with us, because the cover, as you see, reads, "Is there a doctor in the horse?" The Society runs events covering not only ancient but medieval and modern Greek history, as you can see, as well as issues of current concern, such as the potential impact of AI on classics. Many members use the incomparable Hellenic and Roman Library in London, where the books and journals are all on open shelves, and members can borrow most of the books in person or by post and access online materials, and the library also provides scans for members at a very low cost and quickly. Student membership is discounted, and membership forms can be downloaded from the Society's website. To return to the reason why we're here, the series of lectures commemorates 2 members of the university, both prominent citizens of Leicester in their day and both from Tyneside. As many of you know, Dorothy Buchan was head teacher of Leicester High School for Girls. After retiring in the 1990s, she studied ancient history and archaeology with us and served as a very energetic treasurer of the Leicestershire and Rutland branch of the Classical Association, under whose auspices also tonight's lecture is held. Her untimely death in 2000 was a great loss to the university and the city. As we heard from her son Alistair at last year's event, Dorothy's husband, Professor Alan Buchan, was at one time medical officer for North Shields in Northumberland, where he made huge contributions to public health, including establishing the source of a typhoid outbreak. Later, as medical officer for Leicestershire, he created an integrated county-wide health system uniting the various hospitals, and established links with the university that paved the way for the foundation of our medical faculty. Alan's passing last year prompted a flow of new donations to the Buchan Fund, and only this month it has received very substantial gifts from an anonymous friend of the family. The fund supports this annual lecture, our undergraduate ancient history dissertation prize, and a travel bursary which was created following a generous bequest from Dorothy Buchan's sister, Margaret Mary McCrae. The School of Archaeology and Ancient History is proud to be part of Dorothy and Alan's continuing legacy of support for education, for the university, and for the subjects of medicine and ancient history. I found myself looking through the illustrated posters that have been a feature of the series in its middle and later years. Here is a selection, with apologies for a few gaps, which we hope to fill. It reminds me of the exceptional quality of our Buchan lecturers. Indeed, can it be mere coincidence that 3 have taken up posts in the school? The most recent of whom is with us tonight, 2014's lecturer Catherine Tempest, who's going to take up a post with us in February, and we welcome her here. After tonight's lecture, you are welcome to enjoy refreshments in the Law Library, and staff familiar with the route will guide anyone who isn't. I must thank Kate West and other members of our administrative staff for making this event possible, as well as Judith Lopez Aceves and Amy Arden for their expert arrangements, in particular Judith's phenomenal skill with audiovisual systems. Our lecturer is Laurence Totelin, Professor of Ancient History at Cardiff University, where she is the head of the Department of Ancient History and Religion. She is a historian of Greek and Roman science, technology and medicine. She graduated in Brussels, at Cambridge and at University College London, and is the administrator and former co-chair of the Women's Classical Committee UK. She is the reviews co-editor of the Journal of Hellenic Studies and is a fellow both of the Royal Historical Society and the Linnean Society. The lecture is usually on a subject we think Dorothy Buchan would have liked. She wrote her undergraduate dissertation on Hellenistic queens. Tonight's lecture echoes that and also echoes Alan Buchan's interests, for the topic is, as you can see from Dan Stewart's splendid poster, Cleo's Cosmetics, a title which would please our former Professor Peter Wiseman, for those who know about that sort of thing. Cleo's Cosmetics, Hellenistic Queens, and the Ancient Medical Cosmetic Tradition. Please welcome Professor Totelin.
Thank you so much. It's a great honour to deliver this lecture. So I didn't know that Alan Buchan had distinguished himself with an outbreak of typhoid. Perhaps you might want to know, Alistair, that my great-grandfather has a medal now in my possession because he did something similar for the French Republic. So all apologies to Peter Wiseman, whose title I have stolen. This is nothing to do with the Roman Republic and rhetoric. It is really what is written on the tin. It is Cleopatra's cosmetics. So the illustration on your slide is neither Hellenistic nor a representation of a queen. As will become clear, the ancient medical tradition rides roughshod over distinctions of periods and sometimes displays a very limited understanding of chronology and dynasties. As I like to say, the medical tradition flattens history. In the spirit of flattening, and perhaps to disorient you a little bit further away from the knowledge that you might have about the historical figure of Cleopatra VII, I start in 1917 with an advert for Palmolive soap. Cleopatra lies on an ornate couch in a dress that is to be interpreted as oriental. Her white skin contrasts with that of her servants, who are in the background, one of whom fans her, while the two others concoct some potion, probably the marvelous soap that Palmolive calls Cleopatra's vision. The copy extols the knowledge that Cleopatra had of cosmetics, and I read, "The great queen who reigned centuries ago was one famous user of palm and olive oils. Perhaps she pictured the day when modern science would combine them for universal toilet use. For even in the sumptuous days of ancient Egypt, the great natural cleansing agents were only obtainable in their crude natural state. If Cleopatra lived today, she would revel in the greatest of all toilet luxuries, the perfection of these famous oils in the fragrant, creamy cake of Palmolive soap." Copywriters displayed some knowledge of the history of cosmetics. Cleopatra indeed would not have used soap as we know it, something that is explicitly stated on another advert in the Palmolive Cleopatra series, is the one on the right, and I haven't put the text, but you'll have to believe me. Still, had she lived in the 20th century, she would have chosen Palmolive soap. for Cleopatra had good scientific instincts, even though she lived at a time when ingredients were only available in their crude natural state. A modern Cleopatra would make the right cosmetic choices. These choices would have enhanced the alleged whiteness or paleness of her skin, a fact that is stressed in all adverts in an overtly racist manner. As the central advert states, hieroglyphic records prove that while the finish of the royal toilet may have been rouging with carmine or vermilion, thorough radiant cleanliness was always the foundation. The tradition of Cleopatra as an expert in cosmetics has very deep roots. It is partly to be found in the historiographical tradition, if we want to call Plutarch historiographical. Thus, to cite only one example, Plutarch described Cleopatra as a woman who could rely on the trickeries, so that's manga nomasi in Greek, and philtrois of her own person. Plutarch did not explicitly refer to cosmetics, although he does use the word kosmon, but may have been playing with the ambivalent status of beautifying potions, which could be dangerous, veering on the poisonous in their powers. So, for instance, Ovid referred to makeup as poisonous mixtures, compositis venenis in Latin. If you look at examples of cosmetics that are preserved, you can tell that they actually are quite dangerous. So the one on the right is this little tin that was found in London in the early 2000s. When it was opened, it still had the cream in it with the traces of the fingers that had been used to scoop out the cream. This cream actually, when it was analyzed, was found to have tin in it, which is not dangerous for the skin, but and it's perhaps because it was made in the UK, where tin is easy to find. But most ancient creams would have white lead, which is poisonous in the end. And then there's also a big overlap between cosmetics and pigments for painting. So what you have on the left, which is much earlier, it's from classical Athens, has these little cakes of pigments, and it's not clear whether they are for painting the walls or for painting the face. And so we have this ambivalence. It is in the medical tradition, however, that Cleopatra appears most often as an expert in cosmetics. Indeed, we have fragments of a work entitled Cosmetics attributed to a woman named Cleopatra in the works of Galen. So Galen is the main medical author of antiquity, and he lived in the 2nd and early 3rd century CE. While Galen never identified that Cleopatra with the Queen, I follow Rebecca Fleming's suggestion that Cleopatra was a well-chosen pseudonym. I further suggest that Galen may have played with this ambiguity. Other authors, generally later than Galen, were less careful and did attribute cosmetic recipes to Cleopatra the Queen, as well as associating the Queen with other recipes, gynecological in nature this time. I argue that this association of Cleopatra with, on the one hand, cosmetics, and on the other, gynecology, and those are, to a certain extent, modern categories. So I think that this association with these two things stems from the same tradition, that of the ancient cosmetic treatise. Indeed, these treatises appear to have mixed cosmetics with treatments aimed at a better sex life. Before I return to Cleopatra, and indeed other Hellenistic queens, however, I must introduce you to this ancient genre of the cosmetic treatise. So Greek and Roman authors commonly expressed anti-cosmetic sentiments or feigned anti-cosmetic sentiments. So whether they are genuine is often not entirely clear. These authors came from various backgrounds and wrote in different genres, but they often focus their criticism on the notion of fraud. When they use cosmetics, people, especially women, presented a fake image of themselves. They tried to look more beautiful, more attractive, younger than they were in reality. While they shared in this anti-cosmetic culture, medical authors found themselves in a tricky position because the boundary between medical products and beauty products is very blurred indeed. So here I've put some fine portraits, and what they all have in common is the fact that the people that we see here are all wearing some form of makeup. So they are wearing something on the eye, so they're wearing kohl, and that applies to people that we read as women, like this young woman on the left, I think, or the older woman in the center, or the man on the right. And these eye products, so kohl, could serve both as medicine and as makeup, so it protected the eye. Other things, such as for instance, teeth whiteners, could contribute to oral health. Hair dyes could help with precocious whitening of the hair, and so on and so forth. It was therefore not surprising that patients would ask their patients for cosmetics. In their writings, many ancient medical authors included recipes that straddled the boundary between dermatology and cosmetics. Others felt compelled to add excuses and justifications for the inclusion of cosmetic remedies, even if sometimes half-hearted one. For instance, Pliny the Elder and Celsus, both authors active in the 1st century CE and writing in Latin, argued that it was because of the desires of women that they included cosmetics in their works. This is a long passage, but I'll go through the important bits. In the first book of his on the compositions of medicines according to places, which is a book devoted to the hair, Galen too blamed women, this time of royal status, for compelling him to transmit cosmetic recipes. In doing so, however, he went further than any other medical author and created a theory that distinguished between cosmetics and comotics. So the notion of comotics is the notion that he has borrowed from Plato. And he tells us the cosmetic part of medicine differs from the art of embellishment in the following way. The aim of the art of embellishment is to induce a gained or fake or beauty, whereas the aim of the cosmetic part of medicine is to keep everything in the body according to nature, whereby beauty according to nature also ensues. So if you're not familiar with medical text, you're probably not familiar with this formula of according to nature, but it's very, very important in medicine. So medicine has to go with nature, it has to work with nature. Then Galen gives examples of both treatments that pertain to cosmetics and to comotics. And when he talks about comotics, he blames women. They are the ones who want to wear makeup, dye their hair, and make their hair longer. Galen then continues, and that's towards the end of the passage, but because of the overlap between these fields, so cosmetics and comotics, royal women, or even the kings themselves, and when Galen talks about royal women and kings, he's actually talking about the Roman emperors, because to him, those are queens and kings. So because of that, because they sometimes assign to us, and by us he means myself, a task to do with embellishment, it is not possible to refuse them by explaining that embellishment differs from the cosmetic part of medicine. Since On the Composition of Medicine According to Places was probably written during the Severan period, the royal women to whom Galen is referring have sometimes been identified with Julia Domna and Julia Maesa, who are two princesses known for their complicated hairdos. The kings, on the other hand, whom Galen mentions, could be any of the emperors for whom he cared. So those are Marcus Aurelius, Commodus, Septimius Severus, and Caracalla. At the end of the passage, Galen feigns reluctance in transmitting some recipes to promote the growth of hair that he has borrowed from Crito's work on cosmetics. And Crito's work is something that was written in the time of Trajan. So unfortunately, Crito's cosmetics is lost, but Galen does give us much information about it. So he states that Crito had excerpted the work of Heraclides, who was a physician in the 1st century BCE, Cleopatra, and other famous physicians. So interestingly, he lists Cleopatra among the physicians. Galen also informs us that everyone has access to Crito's cosmetics. So it was a very widely available book, and which makes it unnecessary to transcribe many of its recipes, especially since Galen objected to many of these recipes. Instead, and this is entirely exceptional for antiquity, Galen gave the table of contents of the cosmetics, thereby providing much information on the genre. So it's in 4 books, and I haven't put the entire thing, so I've only put things that interested me, but hopefully that gives you a sense. So alongside hair dyes, unguents for the face, perfume recipes, and things for depilation, the work included recipes for unguents for the breasts, for stretch marks following childbirth, virginity preservers, both for boys and for girls, recipes for afflictions of the penis, and also against various prolapses. That is, Crito's cosmetics contained recipes that would not have been out of place in ancient gynecological treatises or sexual manuals. And we know that both of those existed. So the gynecological treatise is a genre that is well known. We have quite a few texts. Sexual manuals is less well known. While ancient cosmetic treatises do not survive, so neither that of Crito nor others, I would suggest that we can find echoes of them in at least 2 extant texts in Greek. These are the Metrodora collection and book 2 of the Pseudo-Hellenic Eucharista. And so I'm sure you don't know these texts. I'll explain a little bit what they are. The Metrodora collection is a text that starts with recipes for various ailments that affect women, and then it becomes more and more cosmetic in nature. Until very recently, this text was known only through 1 manuscript in Florence, but thanks to the work of Irene Cala and Giulia Maria Chesi, 2 further manuscripts have now been added, and apparently they make quite a bit of difference to the text, so I await their edition. The scholars suggest that the text could be as early as the 1st century CE. Previous dates have varied between the 1st century CE and the 6th century CE, and there are good reasons for that, but they think that the nucleus of the text is relatively early. Pseudo-Galen's Eucharista 2, so this is complicated. There's quite a lot of Pseudo-Galenic texts, and this is one of the Pseudo-Galenic texts, and it's called Eucharista, which means remedies easily procured, and there are 3 of those books, but and they're quite different, so all of them have their own characteristics, but I'm interested mostly in Eucharista 2. It's also very difficult to date, but I would say that it probably belongs to around the same period as Galen, or perhaps a little later. The treatise is broader in coverage than the Metrodora text. So it's a text that deals with diseases from head to toe, which is a very common organization in medical texts. So you start with elements of the head, and then you go down the body in an order that doesn't always make sense to us, but that is regular for ancient texts. So this particular text opens with remedies for the hair that are entirely cosmetic in nature, and there's no apologies. The recipes for hair dyes, and that's that. And then it ends with treatises on aphrodisiacs and antidotes against venomous bites, which is again so what you often find in head-to-toe treatises. So you end with the genital organs, and then you have an extra chapter on venomous bites. The treatise, so the Euparista 2, displays a strong emphasis on women's health, and indeed shares a common structure with the Metrodora treatise in various places. So here I have put what you can find in the sections on the breast, which are something I'm particularly interested in. So here, alongside recipes to bring out the milk, to dry it out, and to treat inflammations and other pains of the breast, we find recipes to straighten drooping breasts and recipes to keep the breasts small and pert. So these texts are very useful for gaining an understanding of the beauty standards of the time. So it seems that they weren't very fond of large female breasts. Whether treatises such as the Metrodora compilation and the Euparista borrowed from cosmetic treatises, or whether cosmetic treatises such as that of Crito borrowed from compilations like this, need not matter much for this particular lecture. What we can say is that in various ancient texts, concerns for sexual health, broadly construed, sexual pleasure and cosmetics coexisted. And with this in mind, we return to Cleopatra in the ancient medical tradition. So cosmetic recipes in Greek attributed to Cleopatras, so note the plural, appear in the works of Galen, and I've already told you that Galen is 2nd, 3rd century CE, also in the works of Aetius of Amida, who was active in the 6th century CE and is usually associated with the court of Justinian, and Paul of Aegina, who was active in the 7th century CE. And very interesting character who lived in Alexandria and witnessed the birth of Islam, even though he doesn't mention it, unfortunately. And we also have recipes in the Metrodora compilation. So as I already mentioned, Galen introduced Cleopatra as an author on cosmetics in book 1 of his On Composition of Medicines According to Place, which was the book on the hair. It's also one of these treatises in the head-to-toe order. He recorded 8 of her recipes against alopecia, 4 recipes to promote the growth of hair or prevent it from falling, and 5 recipes against dandruff. In doing so, he insisted on his adherence to the very words of Cleopatra. So on the slide, I have put these formulas where it says, in the very words of Cleopatra. If you're not familiar with medical text, you might think, oh, wow, this is, this is a sure sign that Galen is onto something very important here. But actually, it's a very common formula, both in Galen and in his sources. Indeed, it's likely that Galen did not have direct access to Cleopatra cosmetics, but rather found it cited in Crito's work. Galen never stated that Cleopatra VII was the author of the cosmetics, and instead, as already said, he listed her among the physicians. Galen knew of rulers who had dabbled in medicine, and he acknowledged their expertise. So he mentioned the pharmacological experiments of Attalus III, and he's very proud of talking of Attalus III because Attalus is a king of Pergamon, and Galen is also from Pergamon, so they have this shared ethnicity. And he also knew of the experiments of Mithridates VI, who took poisons and antidotes every day and became immune. And Galen also discussed how Marcus Aurelius tweaked the recipe of the antidote theriac to suit his needs. So he tells us that Marcus Aurelius takes theriac every day, and he changes the amount of the opium in the theriac so that he's not too sleepy. No doubt Galen was familiar with the story of Cleopatra's interest in snakes, and in another pseudo-Hellenic text we do have a story of Cleopatra and the snakes. It is likely then that if Galen had thought the association between Cleopatra and a work on cosmetics secure, he would have noted it, even if he was very well aware that physicians were available in the background to, as it were, ghost write. Galen never did this, but I would suggest that he deliberately juxtaposed in his first book on the composition of medicines according to places, mentions of royal women, who, by the way, are not mentioned anywhere else in the pharmacological works, and mentions of Cleopatra's cosmetics. So I think that we really need to read the passage that I talked about the queens in relation to the fragments of Cleopatra. So in other words, he left the door open to doubt. For there certainly was doubt surrounding Cleopatra's cosmetics, and this is very clearly expressed in a relatively recently published papyrus. So it's from Oxyrhynchus. And the papyrus is a work that lists the literary production of Hellenistic monarchs. And thankfully, we have the passage on Cleopatra, and the text reads, "For the book on cosmetics that claims in the title to be Cleopatra's is not the work of the queen herself, but of somebody who listed the things that she made use of to care for herself." The author understood the ambiguity inherent in Greek formulations of medical titles. So Cleopatra's cosmetics couldn't, and it's the same in English, where you have a sort of genitive, genitive of sorts. So Cleopatra cosmetics could indeed mean both the cosmetics that Cleopatra wrote, or those that she might have used and that were written down by someone else. And this ambivalence, and it's very common in the medical tradition. So we find a lot of references to, Theriac of Nero, or what does that mean? Is it something that Nero used or something that he wrote? So this ambivalence was advantageous as it served to promote remedies by associating them with very famous names. And this ambiguity is clearly on display in a recipe for an unguent of Queen Cleopatra, which is preserved in the works of Aetius of Amida, again active in the 6th century CE, and that's the first text on the slide. So are we to understand that this was a preparation that Queen Cleopatra herself created, or one that she used? And perhaps it doesn't really matter, because what is sought here is the association that comes with the name of the queen. Elsewhere, and that's not on your slide, Aetius transmitted a recipe against falling hair, which is also found in Galen's work. And he doesn't mention that it comes from the book on cosmetics, but he introduced it with the word Cleopatra says. Again, that's quite common to put recipes in the mouth of someone. Paul of Aegina, for his part, and that is on your slide, gave 3 recipes to curl the hair, which were from, and in Greek it's signaled by the preposition ek, so from the recipes of Cleopatra, and those recipes are not preserved anywhere else. Again, there is no explicit mention of the work on cosmetics, but we can suggest that the recipe came from that work and had been excerpted by Crito, whom Paul mentions a few chapters earlier. A final Greek cosmetic recipe associated with Cleopatra is found in the Metrodora collection, and that's the final passage on the slide. It's also my favorite because it uses deer horn, which is one of my favorite ingredients in ancient cosmetics. So this is an unguent to make the face bright, where brightness is to be understood as whiteness or paleness. The reference to the queen here is not to Cleopatra, it's to Berenice, also called Cleopatra. And for those of you who are not experts in the Hellenistic period, and I include myself here, there is in fact a queen called Berenice Cleopatra, so that's Berenice III, who ruled between 101 and 80 BCE. The grammar clearly indicates that it was the queen herself who prepared the recipe and used it. So in Greek, you have feminine participles, and then that indicates that it's really a woman who's preparing it. This recipe may have circulated separately from Cleopatra's cosmetics or as part of it. Perhaps we should associate the work on cosmetics with Berenice Cleopatra rather than with the more famous Cleopatra VII. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter. What is important is the fact that the Ptolemies in particular, and Egypt more generally, could lend authority to cosmetic recipes. Because Egypt had been famous for the production of cosmetics, scented oils, and perfumes for centuries. Already in the writings of the Hippocratic Corpus, and those are to be dated to the 5th and 4th century BCE, we find mentions of medical usage of Egyptian perfumes. And in the Hellenistic period, entire medical treatises devoted to ointments and perfumes were composed in Alexandria. One of these was by the Herophilian Apollonius Mess. So he is a follower of the doctrine of Herophilus, and Herophilus is one of the two most famous physicians of the Hellenistic period. And he wrote a book called On Perfumes. And we only have fragments, unfortunately, but it's quite likely that he covered things like the use of perfumes in the treatment of headaches, and in particular, the headaches that come with drinking too much wine, which is a topic that physicians deal at length with. And in this book, which is lost, unfortunately, but we do have fragments in Athenaeus, Apollonius reported that some female members of the Ptolemaic family had paid a particular interest in perfumes and ointments. So he said, Ephesus in earlier times excelled in perfumes, particularly in the kind called megaleion, but does so no longer. Again, those of Alexandria used to be superior because of the city's wealth and the interest taken in them by Arsinoe and Berenice. Take your pick as to which Arsinoe and Berenice this might be. Perhaps we can think of early Ptolemaic princesses. So, for instance, Arsinoe II and Berenice II of the very famous locks, which were beautifully perfumed. But we cannot entirely exclude much later princesses, such as Berenice IV and Arsinoe IV, who are two sisters, actually half-sister in the case of Arsinoe of Cleopatra VII. And that would change the date of Apollonius Mess, but that's possible. Indeed, throughout the Hellenistic period, Ptolemaic princesses may have had a genuine interest in perfumes whose trade could bring lucrative taxes. Oh, sorry. To sum up so far, the name of Cleopatra was associated with a Greek treatise called Cosmetics, of which fragments on the hair are preserved. Some of the hair products pertain more to what Galen would call chromotics, and others more to cosmetics. One would, of course, have wanted to have fragments from other parts of the cosmetics. Were there deodorants, anti-wrinkle creams, depilation products? We don't know. For now, we cannot answer these questions. What we can say is that, as testified by the Oxyrhynchus papyrus, from an early time, there was an awareness that the name of Cleopatra, that is Cleopatra VII, would have lent authority to a work on such topic. In addition, and to continue the summing up, we have these two other recipes of Queen Cleopatra. In addition, we have two other recipes, one of Queen Cleopatra and one of Berenice Cleopatra. So far, the passages that we looked at belong to a relatively narrow category of cosmetics. They were either remedies to deal with ailments such as alopecia that negatively impact a person's appearance, or they were embellishing potions. We do have, however, further sources that link Cleopatra to other medical material. And in the final part of this paper, I turn to them. So I know that this is very difficult to read, and I'll explain why I have it in this format. So the name Cleopatra is attached to two gynecological writings preserved in Latin this time. One is called the Pessaria, which is a collection of around 20 pessaries, which are vaginal suppositories. And the other one is the Genesia, so the gynecological text, of which there is a longer and a shorter version. The longer one has 43 chapters. So I'm not going to talk about the pessary collection, but I want to say a bit more about the Genesia, which in some manuscripts is known as the Genesia of Queen Cleopatra. So Monica Green, who is an expert on these Latin texts, has suggested that this text had been produced in late antiquity, probably after the 4th century CE, perhaps in a North African context. And that would make a lot of sense because a lot of translations from Greek to Latin were done in the North African context. And we do have example of gynecological texts that were translated into Latin there. Until recently, and despite the fact that this text has intrigued scholars for a long time, there was no modern edition for the Genesia of Cleopatra. And there is now a provisional one with a French translation, and it's in Corinne Lavallee's MA dissertation produced at the University of Ottawa in 2020. So I have put her edition and her translation, but it's available publicly, but because it's a thesis, I wanted to be careful with her material. So what's particularly interested in this work is the preface. The Latin is rather corrupt, and I haven't attempted a full translation, but what we can sort of make out is that the text is dedicated by an author to their daughter, and when that happens, we should probably assume that the author is female, or pretends to be female. And this female author states that she has used several works, including those of Cleopatra and that of a certain Theodote or Theodotus, who is perhaps a physician. The grammar here is particularly muddled. Cleopatra then is not the author here, but a source for the work. And then towards the end of the preface, the author writes, by means of the medical art of the queens Cleopatra and Arsinoe, and here the Arsinoe is corrupted, it's called Arsenes, but we can make out that it is Arsinoe. I have compiled these medical remedies, which I have always used and which I have tested everywhere, and I delivered them to the public. So this emphasis on the testing is very important in medical texts. One should not expect too much historical accuracy here, but the combination of Cleopatra and Arsinoe may hint to the half-sisters Cleopatra VII and Arsinoe IV. And indeed, in one of the manuscripts, which is Florence Pluteus 73-1, in one chapter, the writing switches from, in the grammar, and switches to the first person, and the author addresses her sister, whom she called Arsinoe. So clearly, we are dealing with a rather garbled tradition historically, but what is very interesting is the mention of the translation from the Greek to the Latin. So it is possible that this text has Greek origins. The Genesia deals with various female ailments and displays a certain attention to sexual pleasure. So for instance, in a chapter, and I haven't put the text, but I can tell you about it. So in chapter 7, remedies are prescribed for women who are too cold, an affliction that, according to the author, causes discomfort to their male sexual partners. And recipes to address that particular ailment were found in Creighton's Cosmetics, if we can believe the table of contents I have discussed before. So preparations like that would fit within the remit of the cosmetic genre. And before I leave the Genesia, I just want to note that it's sometimes circulated with a Latin translation of the Metrodora compilation. Cleopatra also appears as a gynecological expert in the Babylonian Talmud, which is compiled between the 3rd and the 6th century CE. So here we are moving across many different languages. And here we learn that Cleopatra subjected women condemned to death to experiments which were meant to determine whether the embryo was when the embryo was fully formed. And she established, against general opinion, that the male and the female embryos were fully formed by the same time in pregnancy. Generally, the ancients believed that the female embryo developed later than the male embryo, but here Cleopatra establishes that they are fully formed by the same time. And this story may be a gynecological twist on another story, which is known through the epic poem on the Battle of Actium. And in that poem, the queen, upon returning from the lost Battle of Actium, experimented upon men condemned to death in preparation for taking her own life. And that tale, and I've put up a passage, and it's particularly gruesome, she does describe the text does describe various ways of taking one's own life, but that tale, in turn, builds upon the tradition of Hellenistic kings such as Attalus III and Mithridates VI, who experimented allegedly on criminals condemned to death. A further source testifying to Queen Cleopatra's interest in women's ailment, as well as in cosmetics, is the Byzantine poet Tzetzes, active in the 12th century. And in 2 places, but here I've put the passage in the Hyliades, he wrote that Cleopatra employed, on the one hand, Dexiphanes to build machines, on the other, the doctors from Ephesus, Soranus and Rufus, for all the ways of embellishing the face and all the afflictions of women and other medical treatments. So here Cleopatra is presented as a patient rather than the author herself. The doctors mentioned here, so I don't know who Dexiphanes is, but the 2 doctors, Soranus and Rufus, are very well known. And you may have heard of Soranus's Gynecology, which is one of the best known ancient texts on gynecology, and a very influential text. Awkwardly, both Soranus and Rufus were active in the 1st century CE and towards the end of the century. That is well after the death of Queen Cleopatra. How did this confusion arise? Perhaps from the fact that Galen and perhaps Crito before him cited both Cleopatra and Soranus as authorities in the field of hair care. In any case, the false chronological association of Cleopatra and Soranus has a very long reception. So in the 17th century CE, 17th century, a forger composed a series of letters in Latin exchanged between Mark Antony, Soranus, and Cleopatra. And that series of letters is Mark Antony asking Soranus for assistance because he cannot cope with the sexual libido of Cleopatra. And then we have some remedies, which actually are real remedies. Another tradition, which is also on the slide, in Arabic this time, linked Cleopatra with Galen. So for instance, in Ibn Abu Ishaya, who is in the 13th century, presents Cleopatra as the teacher of Galen, where gynecological issues are concerned. And he tells us that during his travels to Alexandria, Galen studied medicine with a woman called Cleopatra, who acquainted him with many drugs, especially those suitable for the treatment of women. So here, Cleopatra is not identified as the queen, but she is said to have dwelled in Alexandria. So that makes the identification more plausible. and she's an expert in pharmacological treatments, especially those used in the treatment of women. For the sake of completeness, and I come to the end, I could mention that we also have a table of weights and measures attributed to Cleopatra, which is preserved both in the pseudo-Hellenic treatise on weights and measures and in the alchemical corpus. In the former, so in the pseudo-Hellenic treatise, the table is said to come from the cosmetics, so from the treatise on cosmetics of Cleopatra, but she's not identified as the queen. In the alchemical tradition, on the other hand, she is identified as a queen, but the mention of the cosmetics is dropped. And we have two other texts attributed to Queen Cleopatra in the alchemical corpus. One is this single page of symbols, which is called the Chrysopoeia. And you can see that there are representations here of some of the tools of the trade of the alchemist. And of course, these tools of the trade are quite similar to what physicians would have used. And then the other text is the dialogue with the philosophers. So to conclude, so to sum up, the name Cleopatra was associated with a variety of texts or fragments of texts. These related to cosmetics, gynecology, and alchemy, which I have not dealt with in detail. These traditions developed separately to an extent, but they intermingled at various points. Only a full edition of all the texts mentioned here will allow to firmly answer some of the questions I asked today. Nevertheless, I feel we can suggest that the intermingling of what we call cosmetics and gynecology might have been present in the original cosmetics transmitted under the name of Cleopatra. Indeed, the cosmetics genre had a very broad understanding of what a cosmetic might be, and certainly posited a very strong link between beautifying products and sexual intercourse, a link that goes in both directions. Indeed, sexual dysfunction and gynecological problems can make people seem less attractive. The Cleopatra associated with these cosmetics, gynecological, and alchemical texts is sometimes identified as a queen, generally understood to be Cleopatra VII, but sometimes we don't have this association. We also encountered the names Berenice and Arsinoe, although which queens exactly are meant was rather unclear. Now, Ptolemaic queens and princesses may well have been interested in cosmetics, so cosmetics generally and perfume more particularly. Some may have also developed an interest in medicine more broadly. Hellenistic rulers, including Cleopatra VII, had physicians among their close courtiers, and several did indeed develop an interest in pharmacology. The tradition that associates Cleopatra and other Ptolemaic princesses with cosmetics and gynecology, however, defies the historian who is trying to anchor text to definite historical moments. Chronology is confused, to say the very least. But chronology is not the right lens to understand this tradition. In my view, the right lens is that of advertising, and that is why I started and I end with adverts. Whether it was in the 2nd century CE, the 6th, the 12th, the 17th, or the 20th, the Cleopatra, with her seducing power, was a powerful advertising tool for cosmetic and aphrodisiac concoctions. Any century could reinvent the phrase, if Cleopatra lived today, and mold it to the beauty and sexual ideals of the time. In the background of some of those advertising campaigns, there were also servants, enslaved people, disposable lives in some ancient traditions, black lives as a contrast to Cleopatra's whiteness in the 20th century. And this is an advert that I remember very well from the 80s and early 90s in France and in Belgium, where you had this very shocking contrast between very white Cleopatra and her servants, slaves who were people of color. So if Cleopatra lived today, she would probably reflect some unsavory aspects of the cosmetic industry, as has been her fate for 2 millennia. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Laurence, for a tour de force, if I may say so. The range of the texts that you're dealing with is so bewildering, and the chronology, as you say, is very hard to pin down. At various moments, I was trying to ask myself whether it was possible to trace the evolution of recipes through time. I guess that's very difficult. And then I started asking myself about the nature of authority in these texts, all of which, I think the ones you mentioned, are by men, but which, very interestingly, are sometimes attributing authority to female sources. That's right. Or inventors or experimenters and so on.
Yes.
I mean, the question you keep raising is the one about how credible that attribution of authority is. Why are these male authors continually citing a female as a source in a way that writers in other genres, I suppose, never or hardly ever do? And that, I suppose, the final thing that leads to is, who are these writings aimed at?
Yes. So why do they attribute authority to women? It's linked to this notion that women have knowledge pertaining to their own bodies and cosmetics that falls within that, and gynecology as well. So we do have other examples of women's names associated with gynecological things. And who is the audience is that's more difficult. So it's likely that women could read some of these texts, but yeah, it's likely from, the tradition starts in the 1st century CE, 2nd century. We have relatively good sources for female literacy at the time, so that's possible. But I have spoken about this in other places. It's possible that men were reading those texts, and partly as for titillation. We do have so the ancient evidence doesn't really point to that, but because we're talking of very long traditions, we do have from the early modern period onwards, we do have sources that tell us that men were reading some medical, semi-medical texts as pornography, basically. Yes.
Fascinating.
Yes.
Sorry.
With
time for a few questions. We start with any from the audience in the room. If anybody would like to ask or comment on anything? Not at this moment. Formulating your ideas, maybe. Are there any questions in the chat that might be of interest? Not yet. People are typing.
Is it possible to put it
Alice, over to you.
Thank you. I find that completely fascinating. I'm not an ancient historian or a classicist. I'm a lowly archaeologist in another part of the world, but I found it really interesting in your opening slides where you showed. Obviously, I'm going to ask maybe an unfair question about material culture and how this supports some of the things that you were saying. You showed at the beginning of that wonderful slide of the tin with cream and the different pots that could have contained either some kind of makeup or cosmetics or paint. And I just wonder if there are other indications from material culture which speak to the overlap between the categories that you talk about. So cosmetics and medicine and alchemy and things like that. So I'm really interested in the crossover and connections with materials.
Yes, thank you. Definitely. So we do have, for instance, some some boxes. So it's a type. It's a rectangular box, usually made of copper alloy, with a sliding lid and little compartments. And sometimes what is in there is clearly more medical. Sometimes it's not. And well, and that usually archaeologists have determined that on the basis of who's in the tomb. So if it's a man, or if they interpret the body as that of a man, they will say it's medical. If it's a woman, they will say it's cosmetic. It's a bit more complicated than that, because usually they can be found with surgical instruments as well. But it's not so easy to tell the difference between a medicine and a cosmetic in an archaeological context. So the same goes for. So in Roman archaeology, there are very common types of glass little bottles, and again, those can be interpreted as having cosmetics or perfumes in them, or unguents, or medicine, and it's almost impossible to tell. So there's a colleague called Tom Derrick. Tom was here, wasn't it? Who has written on this type of overlap, and also with magic. You can't really tell whether in an archaeological context whether a glass bottle would have contained some medicine or some cosmetics or a magical potion. It's impossible. Yeah.
If I could return to the question of authority for a moment. I don't know these texts at all, and you've given us just the tip of the iceberg, I'm sure. But was I right to have a sense that the authors in question are not, with one possible exception, talking about their own tests, their own inventions? They're not, on the whole, saying, I do it better than my predecessor, which is a thing that one finds a lot in ancient writings. So they seem a bit devoid of new information, and maybe they're tracing it back to Crito and then to Cleopatra, whoever she is.
Well, yes, it's quite complicated. So they do rely a lot on previous sources, and they often cite them. So you have these formulas in the exact words of, and that will even include the first person. So if the first person is used, which is not uncommon. And it has often been interpreted as a tradition that's very derivative, that is not, doesn't have innovations. But I prefer to see this constant borrowing as a way to. It's a form of historia, basically. So it's a form of creating authority by using past authors. So they do sometimes say, I have done it myself, but having good knowledge, both autopsia, so both seeing for oneself, and historia are very important for the physicians. So I think that's what they are doing. So in many ways, I know it's probably very alien to many of you, these texts, but in many ways, it's not very different from reading something like Plutarch, where you have mentions of other sources, and yeah, they have methods that are quite similar.
Plutarch is giving judgments all the time as well,
yes.
Of course. And I wonder, is there any point of contact at all between most of the writings you quoted and the actual business of people in shops in the street and the people using the stuff and preparing the potions?
Yes, so that's actually my next book. It's on more it's more on the, so it is on trade and retail broadly, and this notion of authority is very important in that, because you're selling you're selling dreams, you're selling names, etc. There are sources on the people who sell the drugs. So people like Galen do mention them, usually not in a very positive way, but he does, and we also have some epigraphical evidence. Yeah.
Well, we look forward to that.
Yes.
As well as your other writings. We've had a very kind comment from Alistair Buchan.
They can hear you online.
Oh yes, Alistair Buchan kindly writes.
Yes, it's my great grandfather rather than my father, but
Dorothy and Alan Buchan would have loved the lecture and been intrigued by the connections with their own family history. Well, thank you for all the kind remarks, Alistair. We reciprocate with thanks once more to your family and all the other donors who allow this series to develop, and we are thinking about new ways to develop the project. I think I see that Alistair's sister Fiona is also typing, but in the nature of Teams, the comments take a while to appear.
Yes,
Oh, there we are. Thank you very much,
Thank
Fiona.
you.
Well, enjoy your extra reading, and I think we all will. We're all inspired to go and look into things. At least I have never looked into before. If there are no more questions or comments, just remains to thank Professor Laurence Totelin once more for an absolutely fascinating lecture.